And we are live. Hi, everybody. Dr. Dana Gibbs. Welcome to the Tuesday Live at 5:30. So today I'm going to do something a little different. I am going to start a 4-part series. So I started writing this little talk thinking it was going to be 15 minutes or so. And when it got to an hour and 10 minutes, I said, I guess I'm going to divide it up into chunks. But anyway, so today is going to be part 1 of a 4-part series. And what we're going to talk about is 2 hormones that you need to know about that are even more important than thyroid. So I'm Dr. Dana Gibbs. I'm an integrated physician here in North Texas, where I help people address their exhaustion, weight gain, and other symptoms caused by thyroid and other hormone imbalances. So if you're listening to this and you're not a physician, please keep in mind scientific proof is not nearly as black and white as people think. And in order to make treatment decisions for individuals, sometimes we have to consider evidence that's not as absolute as we'd like. So this is not meant to be medical advice, and you should consult your own physician for any medical issues or diagnoses that you may have. Okay, here we go. So many of you, if you've watched my lives at all before, have already heard this story, and it is my story. So at the time when it was time for me to decide what I wanted to do with my life, I really wanted to be a doctor. I mean, since I was maybe 10 years old. And I was also really interested in becoming a pilot as well. But poor health and poor stamina really nearly stopped me from achieving those dreams because of how often I was sick and how often I was exhausted, and how often I had sinus infections during my young life. So um, I made the decision, despite the fact that I was worried I couldn't do it, to go to med school. And, even during med school, I would get faint on rounds and nearly pass out. And I was given medicine for depression. I was always exhausted. I didn't sleep well. I was frequently too anxious to fall back asleep if I would wake up in the night. And I had all the symptoms of low thyroid, except because I wasn't overweight and my blood tests looked fine. No doctor diagnosed me with anything. So it turns out that this is really a hormone story. Um, and I had given up on becoming a pilot. And at the time, medicine really was not great at helping people like me manage these subtle hormone disorders. And of course, that's just the start of the story. Um, but anyway, so just going back to really, really basic. So this is a review if you're a doctor, but hormones are chemical messengers that are produced by endocrine glands, which are glands in our body that secrete chemicals that circulate in our bloodstream. And they control our metabolism and a lot of other processes in our body, as you will see. And there are really 6 hormones that are pretty much at the forefront of most people's consciousness. But the top 3 are really testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. People think about those all the time, and they are important, but their quantity and their role is tiny compared to insulin and cortisol. Now, thyroid is also very important. It's the number 6 of those. It drives a lot of metabolic processes, and many people who have hormone problems blame thyroid for all of it. But the insulin and the cortisol are actually far more likely to be causing the bulk of their problems, and probably far more important. So, insulin, a lot of you have heard of that. It's what type 1 diabetics have to take in order to live. It is essential for utilizing energy, particularly glucose, in our bodies, but it also has a lot of other effects. And then cortisol. So, cortisol is the foundation and the master of all these other hormones. And the interesting thing is, we really have total control over what happens with insulin and cortisol in our bodies through our lifestyle choices. So let's start with the cortisol. So cortisol comes from your adrenal glands, which are two small organs that sit above your kidneys, and they secrete substances into your bloodstream because they're endocrine glands. They secrete two kinds of substances. One of them is neurotransmitters, like adrenaline. Everybody's heard of adrenaline, hopefully. Um, and then they also secrete sterol or steroid hormones that are made from cholesterol. And there are maybe 50 different compounds. I haven't actually even counted them all up. There are 50 different compounds that are secreted by the adrenal glands. But the most important one is cortisol. And cortisol, aside from being the master hormone, has lots of beneficial functions. It helps us to stay alert and focused. It allows us to tackle whatever situation is at hand, get our business done more effectively. It plays a huge role in regulating our sleep and wake cycle, our circadian rhythm, by cycling up during the day and down at night. It regulates our metabolism. And in response to injury or infection, cortisol helps reduce inflammation in our bodies. And this can help aid in the healing process short term and protect us against further damage. But cortisol is also the stress hormone, and it helps us route energy to functions that are designed for survival. It is rapidly released as part of an acute stress reaction. And it does a couple of things. First of all, it raises our blood sugar in our bloodstream. By one, rapidly dumping glucose out of our liver. It does this to provide energy to our brain and our muscles so that we can survive these acute stress situations. It also prevents glucose from being sucked up by the non-essential cells by triggering what's called insulin resistance. And we'll talk more about that in a second. It enables us to be focused and alert to danger, to life, from whatever this acute stress event is, by raising what's called sympathetic tone. And it shuts off functions that are not essential for our immediate survival, like digestion, reproduction, and growth. Think your hair, healthy hair and nails, healing and immune surveillance. So cortisol is not essentially inherently bad. It is necessary for life. So, for example, people who don't have or make cortisol in their bodies will drop dead running to catch a flight or during a major surgery because their blood sugar will drop too low to sustain life. So what is stress? What do we mean by stress, and what kind of stress is there? So stress is anything that our primitive brain sees as a threat to our survival. So think about a tiger stalking us, because early in human history, we were not at the top of the food chain, and our bodies evolved to handle the stress of being prey. And there's also acute stress, like running from the tiger. That's the cliche. But then there's more chronic stress because food was scarce and there was war and slavery and being exiled. And these things might not kill you today, but they were definitely a threat to your survival. And when stress arises, our body really reacts in a very predictable way by releasing adrenaline and cortisol into our bloodstream. And the more prolonged the stress is, the more pronounced and persistent that hormone release reaction becomes. Because we needed to be able to do sustained, hard physical work, like running away or like migrating to where there's actually food, and conserve energy to get away from danger to find food. And these responses were considered to be adaptive. And doctors use the word adaptive to mean that those responses help us with survival. But what causes the stress reaction? Let's go into it a little bit more. So it all happens extremely quickly. So it starts with a thought. For example, that tiger is after me, I might die, which triggers the emotion, fear. And the adrenaline is released within a fractions of a second, and then cortisol within 30 seconds into your bloodstream. And it's the emotion that signals the release of the factors that release those two hormones. And when the adrenaline hits your bloodstream, when the cortisol hits your bloodstream, it gives you the energy to act, to run if you can, or to fight if you have to. And after that happens, it can take several hours to days after the event has passed for those levels of hormones in your bloodstream to go back down again, and to let that heightened vigilance, and anxiety drop off. So, what are some other causes of stress? Because stress can be external, caused by danger, a car wreck, or another accident, but it can also be physical, like pain or malnutrition. Um, we do this to ourselves a lot of times with calorie restricted dieting, or inflammation, or illness, or lack of sleep, or even over exercising. Or it can be situational. There's lots of modern first world circumstances like pressure and lack of autonomy at work, the economy, our kids, our relationships. And it's really how we think about these situations that causes the stress and the stress reactions. So we humans are also really the only species that have evolved the ability to worry about things that we can't even control, or that we imagine even before they happen. So chronic thoughts about, oh my gosh, what if I get cancer? What if I can't pay my bills? What's wrong with my kids? Why me? So these imagined bad scenarios are indistinguishable to our brain from an actual bad event happening to us, and the stress reaction and the release of the hormones is the same. So sometimes we can even, in a way, be addicted to stress because it gives us that quick energy boost from the cortisol and the adrenaline. Think pushing deadlines, overscheduling, being habitually late. That's manufactured stress by our brains. So, but the really important thing about the stress and about that release of cortisol is that it comes from our thoughts about the circumstances that result in 5 specific emotions: fear, anger, disgust. And you would think, why disgust? Well, it's so we don't eat spoiled or poisonous things. And then shame, and then sadness. And these 5 emotions are the ones that trigger our survival instincts by releasing cortisol and adrenaline. Um, and the control system of almost all those hormones is in the base of our brains. Um, and so the thoughts come from your frontal cortex, and your frontal cortex feeds those thoughts to your amygdala, which compares the situation to historical situations that may have been dangerous. And they create these negative survival emotions. Then the signal goes to a different part of your brain called the hypothalamus, and then to the pituitary, where the signaling of hormones comes from. And all of your hormones, almost all of them, come from the hypothalamus signaling to the pituitary to release chemicals that then go out into our body to tell those adrenal glands to make hormones. So that axis is called the hypothalamo pituitary axis. Now, there are lots of other factors besides stress that also influence the amounts of ACTH that we have going on in our body, particularly including like the time of day, and then a feedback control loop from cortisol, which in normal situations, when cortisol is high, it feeds back and says, make less of this. And that whole system is the HPA axis. So when the pituitary releases those signal hormones that go out to all the rest of the endocrine glands to tell them to get to work, this is not just for cortisol. So the system controls a big old list of hormones like growth hormone, like the gonadotropins, FSH and LH, which are the ones that cause you to release sex hormones, prolactin, aldosterone, and several others. And under normal circumstances, things stay in balance and all is well. But when you add stress to that system, it starts causing problems. And the problems with modern stress, beyond the fact that we frequently create it for ourselves in our imagination, are 2. First of all, it's generally not just a once every few weeks kind of thing. Usually it's a pattern, it's a daily grind. And that can actually hijack the production of your other hormones in your body through prioritizing what it perceives as necessary for survival. So I tend to use a factory as an analogy for what's going on here. So if you think of your brain and those pituitary chemicals as orders to the factory being the adrenal glands and the other endocrine glands, um, and the factory is supposed to be able to make several different kinds of vehicles, for example. If on orders from the brain, the ACTH signal gets way increased, then the production of cortisol gets increased. So if cortisol is like tanks and the government decides, hey, you know what, we need way more tanks, then the factory doesn't have the excess capacity to make the other kinds of cars, the station wagons or trucks or anything like that. So the other orders tend to start getting canceled, including thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, because having an active metabolism, which is what thyroid does, is not as important as conserving energy so that you don't starve to death. Growth hormone, because we can always grow later, gonadotropins, which are what makes the sex steroid hormones, estrogen and testosterone, these slow down because in a survival situation, you don't have the excess energy to reproduce, and it would slow you down if you were pregnant or had a baby to drag along with you while you were trying to migrate to a different continent, for example. And so all the other hormones kind of get knocked off the assembly line as less important in favor of keeping the cortisol coming. And eventually even aldosterone, which is really a critical, necessary for life hormone. If it gets low enough, then your blood pressure starts dropping and you get dizziness and you get fainting spells. And then in regards to the sex hormones, progesterone is a really unique situation because progesterone is really early in the assembly line as far as a product that leads to all the other steroid hormones, including the cortisol and the estrogen and testosterone. So it actually becomes a supply chain issue. So if you run out of progesterone because you're using it all to make the cortisol, then you can't make testosterone or estrogen. And then the result is that you have no more sex hormones. And there are tons of downstream effects to having daily chronic elevations in cortisol that we are going to go over next time in part 2. All right, so that's it for now. Except today, I'm going to go ahead and announce that in March, I'm going to start a 4-week program, an experiment with continuous glucose monitors. So this is a 4-week program that's going to start pretty soon, where all the participants will get and wear a CGM for the whole time for 4 weeks, keeping journals and experimenting with differences in exercises and food choices and timing of meals, and rest on your real-time and average blood sugar levels. So if you aren't already on my mailing list and you're interested in that, you can sign up today at www.danagibbsmd.com, and it is going to be really fun and really interesting, and I hope to have you join me there. So that's it for now. Thanks for listening, and I will see you next week.